Believe it or not, I was born in Edmonton, Alberta. I was told by my father that I was born in a store, in an apartment over a store on Jasper Avenue. We left there when I was about 2.5 years old because my mother died and my father married again and moved with my stepmother, as I called her for years, to Ottawa, and then we went from Ottawa to Montreal. I'm of Jewish origin, and the big Jewish community is in Montreal, the biggest of all in Canada. And my new mother, she wanted to be with her relatives and friends, and eventually we ended up in Montreal. I grew up in that environment, and I remember meeting some young people who lived near us in Montreal, who were members of the Young Communist League. And they gave me some literature. And the Communist Manifesto by Marx and Engels, Value, Price, and Profit, the lecture that Karl Marx gave to expose citizen so-and-so as being a dunce in terms of economics. My mother came in one day and she opened the drawer and she found these books. She said, "No, why are you reading communist literature?" I said, "Because I'm a socialist." And she said, "If you want to be a socialist, why don't you become a respectable socialist?" And she had in mind people that we've seen in the leadership of certain social democratic parties, including the Canadian Social Democratic Party, who were just as much in favor of the system as they were against it. So basically that was my background. At the same time, I came in touch with some people who were on the left, members of the Young Communist League, and I joined. I didn't have a very clear idea of why I joined. And for a few years, I'll be quite frank, I just bummed around. I didn't work very much. I didn't hold on to a job, although it wasn't hard for me to get a job because my new mother's relatives could always provide work. My father was working for Rhine's Dry Cleaners, one of the first big outfits in Montreal that had outlets all over the big city and used to have their drivers pick up every day and return the stuff from the factory. He went to work for them. One, he was a very good worker. They were lucky to get him. Two, he was a relative of my mother. I remember one day these three pressers came, not far off of Christmas, and they had some food that my mother prepared, and they had some drinks and that, and then they left. And my father said this, and I've told you that, Jenny, on a number of occasions. I never agreed with it. He said, "They treat me like I was one of them, but never forget, they are Frenchmen, and underneath the skin they're all anti-Semites. They hate the Jews." Now, I never believed that. And one of the things that I learned when I left home is that there are good French Canadians, bad French Canadians, good Jews and bad Jews, and that there was a class. That the working class French Canadians were much closer to me than the capitalist Jews. I've never forgotten that. But 1935, I started to hitchhike to different parts of Ontario. And I also took the freight train and came to British Columbia. Went through Alberta and then British Columbia. I've had many experiences. I can remember in Ontario, in the middle of the winter, freezing one of my feet, and being in the hospital and all wrapped up in these cloths and the absorbent cotton and the oil. I spoke to a lot of people who put me wise to the fact that if I wanted to go to the far west, hitchhiking wasn't the way. The best way was to ride the freight trains. I wanted to go to Toronto. If I want to take a freight train, I learned where the freight train would start from, where it would slow down on a big grade not far from the starting point, where we could hop on. We had to learn what kind of a freight train too, because on certain cars it would have meant your life to try and ride on them. You had to have something you could hold on to, right? That was not too dangerous. But at any rate, my memory is not too good on all of these points connected with the freight trains. But suffice it to say, I ended up in British Columbia. I was on the trek to Regina. It was a trek to Ottawa, which was broken up in Regina. And which means that I must place my arrival in British Columbia had to be about 1933 or 34, because the trek was in 35, wasn't it? I remember that we went to Calgary. I remember holding meetings there and how the people organized demonstrations, particularly the followers of the left-wing Ukrainian and Russian organization, Communist Party, trade unions, either directly or indirectly through committees that were set up in support of the trekkers, how they fed us. And I remember ending up in Regina. I'll never forget that day when the police attacked the demonstration. We were all standing in the square in Regina, and I was near a curbed sidewalk, and a big truck pulled up. I'll never forget the name, Peacock Pounder. The tarp went up, and here it was full of Mounties. And they just rushed out, hitting left and right with their crops. Heavy loaded crops. They didn't give any order to cease and desist. There was no such order. And from the other side of the square, the city police moved in. I was one of those who was picked up. We weren't beaten, we weren't abused or in jail. But we were asked, "Were you a member of the Communist Party?" And I wasn't going to get my head knocked in, and I just took out a leaflet I had from the CCF, said I'm a member of the CCF. And the policeman said to me, "Well, that doesn't say much for the CCF." So that was quite a lesson. One lesson I learned from that, to use the classical Marxist terminology, I learned what the state really means. The state is not only an apparatus to regulate commerce, regulate highways, run the schools. It is also an apparatus to use force against any threat to the main upholders of the state, who it represents. I'd read 15 or 20 books on that subject, including State and Revolution by Lenin. I'd read it by that time. And I've read hundreds of books since, but nowhere was that lesson driven home more forcefully than it was on the square in Regina. I was with the single unemployed, the radical unemployed, and the NDP was, or CCF as it was known then, was not organizing them. It was the communists who were organizing them. And this is one thing we should never forget, that in those days there were thousands of hungry and footloose young people, thousands of young people who had no orientation as to where they could hope to go, what they could hope to achieve. And the people who were organizing against evictions, the people who were organizing for relief, people who were organizing for unemployment insurance were the communists. And that's what attracted thousands and thousands of people to our communist movement. I say our communist movement because I regard the communist movement as being the best thing in my whole life. It educated me. It taught me what class I belonged to. And it gave me a good system of ethics and moral values without having to suffer a lot of mistakes through ignorance. I'll digress for a moment. I can remember being in a rooming house on Main Street here shortly thereafter, and I read all night 10 Days That Shook the World by, what's the name? John Reed. I started to read that book at about 7 o'clock at night, and I read all night, and then I went to sleep after that. And now you see what I mean when, to many of us, the communist movement was our university. We knew it wasn't perfect, but we were willing to overlook its imperfections because we felt it had a dynamism, it had a logic, and above all, it had a soul. And that was the soul of the people. A number of my communist friends were working with the outside workers in Vancouver, and they told me they were hiring. So I got a job there. First I worked for the sewer department, then I went to work for the school board. I switched over as a groundsman, unskilled. This is just my chance, and I joined the union. Many times after they attacked our union, or during the lengthy attacks against our union, the right wing, the labor movement, and the daily press, Sun and Province, screamed that there was a conspiracy, that the communists had joined together to take over the public works of the city of Vancouver in order to be able to sabotage in case of war. Actually, we came together by accident. There was no plan. There was no leader. There was no dispatching of people. We just drifted together. We all wanted to do something. We wanted to work. And we wanted to be in an environment where we could influence other workers. Just an instinctive feeling. Why were we communists, the people I'm speaking of? Because we believed that they had the only answer to the class struggle. In the first place, they accepted it, where a lot of the reformist trade union leaders did not accept it. We believed in it. Secondly, we believed that those of us who were in the party had the opportunity to learn what the class struggle is all about, how to evaluate our tactics, how to devise a program, and above all, how to serve the workers. There wasn't one of us who was looking for a job in the sense of using the labor movement to get by. I remember we got together in 1947. We discussed the upcoming elections, and we decided that we would unite around Don Guise, who was working for this city. Then he was from Alberta, Lethbridge. And he pointed out to us that the union was in a terrible shape. There was no checkoff, and the business agent was something of a drunk. And he used to collect dues and mark it in a little black book which he carried in his pocket. Now, the worst way you can pay your dues as a union member is to a drunk who writes it in a little black book which he can lose. And there was no shop steward system, and I don't think 40% of the outside staff, which numbered some 17 or 1,800 at that time, were members of the union. And Don, who had worked among the miners as an organizer, he hammered away that we had to build a union and build a stewards movement. And finally, the day of the election came along. I had been nominated to be recording secretary. And strictly on the basis of chance. Don nominated me and said that I was good on the typewriter. I wasn't. I never became a good touch typist. But this is the element of chance that comes into it sometimes, you see. And I was nominated for recording secretary. Came the day of the election. I went to the place where we were going to vote. And the chap who was opposing me, there were two was running for that spot. He come up to me and he said, "Jack," he said, I'd like your advice. I said, "Well, on what subject?" He said, "This election." So even then I learned when to keep my mouth shut and when to listen. I didn't say a word, I just listened to him. I said, "Why are you asking me that?" He said, "I don't know whether I should run for secretary, for position recording secretary." I said, "Why?" "Well," he said, "I'm a sub-foreman." And some people might resent it. They might figure that I'm throwing my weight around on the job and then using my weight in the union and trying to get the best of both worlds. It's rather a crude way. That's what he said. In other words, he said to me, "Should I run?" I didn't say yes, I didn't say no. I said to him, "If you feel that way, then you should make up your mind right now what you're going to do. Don't let it slide." He said, "Look, Joe, we haven't got much time. We're going to be voting in about half an hour." "Well," I said, "if I was in your position and I felt uneasy, I would withdraw." He said, "I'm withdrawing." And I became the secretary. Subsequently, the board, on Don Guy's request, asked me to go on the staff full time. I never asked for it; they asked me. This shows you how an accident, or an accidental event, you want to call it that, can bring about bigger changes in your life and in a relationship between people than many planned programs. That was about 1947. It's obvious that even a section of the membership of the union were kind of frightened as to what Don Guys and Jack Phillips stood for, as they began to realize that we stood for a militant policy. However, we won most of them over, and we won over a big middle section, basically around one question, and that is service to the membership. We started to build a stewards movement to get somebody in every job of any size who would represent the workers. Don Guy played a big role in that. We were a victim of the Cold War. It hit us very hard. This was 1947, 48, 49, 50, that period. That was the kind of atmosphere, and the daily press was hammering away against communism. Don't forget, this was in the period shortly after Winston Churchill made his Fulton, Missouri speech, in which he said, "The Iron Curtain has descended on Europe." And as far as the right wing of the Trades and Labour Congress of Canada was concerned, they saw this new Cold War period as an opportunity to consolidate their positions in the labor movement and to isolate and destroy the influence of the Communist Party. It was that simple. And the Trades and Labour Congress of Canada, to which we were affiliated, also in the main supported that policy. The decisive section of the leadership, dominated by leaders of the craft unions from the USA, the international unions. And in that setup, we found a situation in which one local of municipal employees, called Local 28, was in confrontation with its parent body, the Trades and Labour Congress of Canada. That in itself is a story that could be told in some detail, because originally we were directly chartered by the American Federation of Labor in the USA. And then, because of certain stirrings of reform elements in the labor movement, the parent body became the Trades and Labour Congress of Canada. That was a concession to the demand for Canadian autonomy. Well, I didn't know anything about this history, neither did any of those associated with me in the so-called left group who took over the leadership with the support of the rank and file. I inherited that situation, along with others. However, I should say that we were one of the unions in the country that was led by the left communists and people who were friendly to the communists, and left social democrats. I mean that in a general sense, not a pejorative sense. And we were against the Cold War. Where the Cold War advocates in the labor movement were getting ready for a world war against socialism, we were promoting the collection of signatures for the international peace petition. We took a very big delegation down to Calgary from our local union, Local 28. We took every delegate we were entitled to elect. I forget the precise number, I'd have to look it up. But we all voted solid against the expulsion of the Canadian Seamen's Union, because we were not in favor of replacing them by the gangster-led Union of Hal Banks of the USA, the Seafarers International Union. And that, shall we say, sharpened the division between us and the right-wing leadership of the Trades and Labour Congress of Canada very noticeably. During the period when we were being attacked, there was the international collection of signatures for the Stockholm peace petition. And we supported it and endorsed it. And the Vancouver Sun, I'll never forget that, came out with an editorial, Plotting by Petition. The Vancouver Sun editorial board of that time was convinced that the communists and unions all across Canada were utilizing the Stockholm peace petition to undermine the defensive capacity of the Canadian government in its support of American foreign policy. I can't put it any simpler. And they attacked us. I remember the time I got arrested for collecting signatures. I was standing on the corner with my back against the wall of the bank at a kitty corner across from Woodworth, Imperial Bank of Commerce. I did that because I didn't want to be accused of interfering with people walking on the sidewalk. I think that was Abbott, wasn't it? Abbott and Hastings. And this very officious policeman who'd been a policeman in Shanghai at a time when the British control of Shanghai was at its height. He was running all over the street, blowing his whistle and flagging people down, and he ordered me to get off the street corner. That I had no right to petition for anything like the Stockholm peace petition. Somehow or other, I had the feeling at that time I was no hero. I've been more of a coward than a hero in these matters in my lifetime. I'm no hero, but I got the idea. If I give in and other people give in, we're going to lose the right to petition on the streets. And I said, I'm sorry, I'm not moving. He said, what do you mean? Are you disobeying an officer? I said, I'm obeying my conscience. I'm not going to move. So he phoned for the paddy wagon. They arrested me, and they arrested a whole bunch of people. But that's the atmosphere in which we operated in. You can imagine how some of the more conservative members of our local felt when they read in the paper that their secretary, working full-time for the union, was arrested for peace petitioning. Came 1950, we had the convention of the Trades and Labour Congress of Canada meeting in Montreal. That was where the Cold War and the labour movement was officially launched. Don Guys and I were refused admittance to the convention. I forget the number, but a number of other prominent trade unionists were also refused admittance. Johnny Hines, the painter. But a whole number of people were banned. You just can't come in, you're communists. There was no legislation on the books of the Trades and Labour Congress of Canada, but they assumed that there was. Or they assumed they could act as if there was sufficient policy resolutions to justify what they were doing. I remember that meeting in the Mount Royal Hotel. That used to be the main hotel in Montreal. It's not the main hotel now. Across the street from the Peel building, which was part of the garment trades area. And I remember the Red Squad walking up and down in the aisles. I remember Johnny Hines getting up and saying something that got him thrown out. He pointed out that there was somebody on the floor from the American FBI. Whether it was true or not, I don't know, but he said so. At any rate, we decided that Don Guys and I, we decided that we would go before the executive of the Trades and Labour Congress of Canada. And we came into this room, and Jodoin was presiding. He was the president, Claude Jodoin. And there are all sorts of documents on this table. They were petitions. We weren't allowed to look at them. Petitions from members of the rank and file of the union asking that we be kicked out because we were communists. They had a support, minority support, but they had some support. Largely from immigrants who had been brought over from Europe, the kind of people who were concentration camp guards when my wife was in the camps, Ukrainians of German origin who had served in the SS. And a lot of these came into Canada, and the city of Vancouver hired a share of them, particularly scavenging. They knew more about my background than I did, and I figured it out that the RCMP had filled them in. So here he had all these petitions, and the first thing he showed when I said, he looked at me, he said, Mr. Phillips, you work for Joe Stalin. I said, no, I'm working for peace. He said, don't give me your propaganda. I just listened to it without saying a word after that. And that was the end of it. We had our hearing. And then they sent a chap by the name of Karl Borg out here to take over the union. He was a vice president from the labourers' union stationed in Alberta at that time. The labour movement has certain established procedures and traditions and certain ways of doing things. In a situation like we were in, it is normal to take one high-ranking official and make him commander-in-chief. Pardon the expression. We want to take over that local union. Here's how, here's why. You go and do it. And he was given that assignment as the vice president of the Trades and Labor Congress. The atmosphere that we worked in was a very, very difficult one at that time. The Vancouver Sun and Province, and then we had the News Herald for a while, were against the leadership of the Union. The radio was against the Union. Although we tried within that framework to soften the news media in its approach to us and to get our side presented in the best way possible. It was a very difficult thing to do, but we did it. We had to avoid some sectarianism. I'll give you an idea of what I mean by avoiding sectarianism. I knew very little about the trade union movement until I went to work for the union, and I was learning on the job under good people like Don Guys and many others. And somebody came up with the idea that when we went into negotiations, we should ask for an increase in our sick pay, but only for those who were members of the union, which in effect was designed to prevent a small minority of the enemy within our ranks from getting the negotiated increase. Now, looking back, I can see that was a very stupid thing to do. And yet we raised it seriously, and we're going to go forward to it until I suddenly realized this is a trap. Because who are we, the leadership of the union, to say that the government has given us the legal bargaining rights for such and such a group? We will represent you, you, and you, but we won't represent you. We could have lost our whole certification if we'd gone ahead with that. Because once you are certified, the government gives you the responsibility of representing that group of workers, every group, including those who are against the leadership, in collective bargaining. So what I'm trying to get across, and pardon my coughing, is the fact that for Don Guys, even though he was very experienced, and for myself with very little experience and others, it was a learning process. We had to learn a lot of these things. But we had some damn good friends who gave us a lot of advice. People who had gone through similar situations in their own unions, like IWA, Mine Mill, and many others, United Electrical Workers, and who've been expelled basically because their unions had fought for good policy. So it was a learning experience. The press was against us. The establishment was against us. But there was one thing which was in our favor, and that is that while they set up a splinter union, Local 407, to take away our membership, they won only 2 small certifications from it. A small group at the airport and the Vancouver School Board outside workers. Now, if the policy of the City Hall had been different, we might have lost out completely, because their policy was they did not want a bunch of unions, 8, 10, 12, split up on the basis of various crafts. They wanted to deal with one big union for the outside workers as a whole. And that was in our favor. It helped us. Because there were times when individual units within the outside workers were almost solidly against the union. The situation fluctuated. I remember telling a group a while ago, and they were amazed that there was a period in which we went to the dump every day, went to the different yards every day, and we were putting out a leaflet a day. I don't suppose they were great literature, because I wrote them, and I'm not a great writer. I used to think I was, but I'm older now and wiser. But nevertheless, they had their effect. I'll never forget how friends helped us to correct one of the biggest mistakes that we ever made. The president of the Vancouver Labour Council, not the CCL, Canadian Congress of Labour, but the Trades and Labour Congress of Canada, headed by German and Schouler. They were working against us. Now, at one stage, the president was Tom Alsbury, who later became mayor. And he was coming to the dump every day, and he was making speeches. And Don guys and I made the mistake of debating with him. And he was telling all sorts of stories about the communists in Russia, and we were denying him and saying that we had no connection with the communists in Russia. And when I was describing this to some of my friends, they said to me, "Jack, you're a stupid son of a bitch." And I said, "Why am I a stupid son of a bitch?" It's the very language he used. I won't tell you who he was. And he said, "So is Don Guy." He said, "Don should know better." I said, "Why are we stupid son of a bitches?" Well, he said, "You should never debate day after day with a guy like Alsbury. You're building him up. You are building him up as an alternative to the good policy that you stand for. Drive him off the dump. Don't debate anymore." And I remember after getting that advice, I went to see Don, and I sat down and explained to him, because we all had a great respect for him. He had more experience than the rest of us. He said, "I think that's good advice, Jack." So we got a loudspeaker, put it on the car, and next day we went to the dump, and Alsbury was ready for his debate. And Don Guy said, "I want to handle this personally." And he drove to the microphone, and he said, "You rotten son of a bitch, Alsbury. You're a strike breaker, and you're no goddamn good. Get off this dump. You have no members here." And we had some people who moved in, and they drove him off the dump. He never came back. That's a story I've never told before. I should point out that one of the reasons why the Red Baiters in the trade union movement selected the Trades and Labor Congress to lead the attack was that we were directly chartered by the Trades and Labor Congress of Canada. That was our parent body. We weren't in an organization like CUPE or any other national or international body. Before the war, we were organized by the AFL-CIO in the USA, and after the war, they gave the local to the Trades and Labor Congress of Canada. But from this flows the essence of how we saw the fight back, because from 3 or 4 years before the war, I'd have to, War I, we existed on our own. Formerly, we paid per capita to the Trades and Labor Congress of Canada, but they did nothing for us. They didn't organize our members for us. They didn't negotiate for us. They didn't do research. They just accepted us as an affiliate. And that gave us the right to have delegates to the Labor Council and to send people to conventions. So you can see that we had been on our own for a long time. And although I didn't have much experience in the labor movement, and I'm using the pronoun I, and I'm trying to give credit to others where it's due to them and take credit for myself where it's due to me, I had this feeling, what is the main tradition of this local, for good or bad? And there were good side and bad side. The main tradition was that they elected their own officers and ran their own affairs. And the Trades and Labor Congress of Canada did nothing for them except give them legitimacy. So out of the studies that I made and the suggestions that I came up with, people with much more experience than I had in the labor movement advised us to hammer away at one theme. We are defending the right to run our own affairs and elect our own officers. The whole tradition of the local was that of just being formally connected with the Trades and Labour Congress of Canada, but running its own affairs. We tried everything we could to save the union. Finally, we devised a tactic of turning the union over to the job stewards. We turned it over to them, and we worked out the approach. It's our union, and we want to save it. In other words, they tried to push us into the bureaucracy, the right-wing bureaucracy of the Trades and Labour Congress of Canada, which was mainly controlled by the big international reps, tried to push us into the position where we will repeat the mistake of the IWA leadership in 1947 of pulling out and setting up another union. We said, no, we're staying in our union. It's our union, and we demand the right to elect our own officers and run our own internal affairs. Now, to understand the power of that slogan, and if I was writing it out, I'd put it a bit smoother than I'm putting it here. You understand that. To understand the power of that slogan, you must understand that the IWA, the communist leadership of the IWA, made a big mistake. Instead of staying in the union and fighting, they pulled out and set up a union before the decisive sections of the membership were ready for another union. We learned the lesson from that between 1947 and 50, 51, 52. And we said, we've always run our own internal affairs and elected our own officers. We want to continue that way. It's our union. You're trying to take it away from us. It's a tribute to the communist leaders of that time that they gave us this kind of advice. That they had analyzed a mistake that was made in the IWA and said to people like myself, to Don Guy and others, now don't make the mistake of the IWA. It's your union. Stay in there and fight for it. Hang on to it. Not that you can compare one local with 3 or 4 units like the Parks Board, the P&E, and the City of Vancouver with the IWA, but in essence, politically, there is a valid point of comparison. In the first place, we were raided by the Congress. They set up 2 separate unions on 2 separate occasions over a period of about 3 or 4 years to take away our membership. And Karl Berg led the drive. And they won a section of our membership too. But we hammered away strictly on the basis of trade unionism. And we'd go to the dumps, we'd go to the yards, we'd go to all the big construction jobs, maintenance centers, and we would give out those leaflets. We hammered away. The main thing is wages and working conditions. And we are constantly accusing the leadership of the Trades and Labour Congress of Canada of sabotaging the welfare of our members. And we won them on that basis. So when we set up the new union, we just consolidated what we had. We didn't leave it and go somewhere else. We didn't secede. We found ourselves being an affiliate of the Trades and Labour Congress of Canada, and our parent body was always attacking us, setting up new locals. So on that basis, we applied for certification under a new name, and we won. What we fought for was not to set up a new union, but to save our union. That's the difference. The union belongs to you, not to those bureaucrats. The main lesson that I learned was that if you appeal to the basic class instinct of the working people, and they have half a chance to respond freely, their instinct will eventually guide them to do the right thing. What we did is we adopted a new name, the Vancouver Civic Employee Union Outside Workers. Outside Workers. And believe it or not, we called a special meeting. I read the draft constitution, moved from one end to the other, which is a tough job to do. We adopted it. We sent it away to Victoria. We took over all the certifications of the original union. Later, in 1966, we became part of the Canadian Union of Public Employees. I think the one constant positive virtue that stands out is I never lost sight of the fact that progressive left-wing trade unionists should not be in a tributary, separate and apart from the mainstream. They should be in the mainstream. And I felt that we had a role to play in the labor movement. We, I mean the leadership of that local and our friends, and that we should not submit to being separated and isolated from the mainstream of the labor movement. That we belonged in the Labor Council, we belonged in the Federation, and we belonged to the Congress. We had to fight for our place. And it took a lot of convincing. A lot of the rank and file said, why give them per capita? Those rotten bastards, they don't do anything for us anyway. And it was easy to give in to that sentiment and also to pose as a great leftist. Because our worst leftist sectarians followed the same line. They're no good, they're a bunch of bastards, they're reactionaries. Why pay them per capita? Why pay to keep them in these good jobs? But what they tended to forget, and what I couldn't forget because of my education by the party, what I couldn't forget is that the vast majority of the organized workers followed the thinking of these people in the center and in the right wing. And it wasn't a question of accepting the ideas of certain people that we didn't like. It was a question of accepting the level of thinking of the overwhelming majority of the rank and file, and living with it and working with it and pulling them a step forward. I used to go to the provincial conventions, I used to go to the national conventions, and CUPE always paid my way, or rather the local always paid my way. There was a lot of resentment that I had to overcome because people could not see why I was always insisting that we fight to take our place in the new National Union of Civic Employees and in the Trades and Labour Congress of Canada. The only personal credit I take is that I feel, looking back, that I recognize the possibilities of that period at an early stage, and I advocated that we should follow a certain policy and help to convince others. But it wasn't only me. It was Don Guys and some 30 or 40 people who had been expelled, don't forget, by the Trades and Labour Congress of Canada. Anybody who became a leader, a job steward, or an executive member of the local, who had any leadership ability was automatically expelled by them. I felt, along with others, that our place was inside the labor movement. That the bulk of the municipal employees in the province were inside the Trades and Labour Congress of Canada through different charters and affiliations. A complicated affair. And they were loyal to it, and they were moving in a certain way to defend their own interests, using that network of affiliations as part of their apparatus to win better conditions and wages. And I felt that we should be part of that movement, one for the advancement of our own members. And this idea of some big communist plot, the papers were full of it, was just so much baloney, because the Communist Party could only do so much. The main thing the Communist Party did in this situation was to give us advice when we asked for it, and to advise us against doing anything reckless or foolish. And they insisted that we should learn the lessons of the IWA. We had all sorts of people who saying, we don't want to go into the National. We're happy the way we are. Why should we pay per capita? We can do better on our own. And we resisted that, and we developed every logical argument. The main argument we developed was, of course, that the public employees of this country should have their own unions representing their own interests, but should be part of the labor movement as a whole. And that the unions representing public employees should recognize their responsibility not only to their own members, but to the working class. And if the Communist Party did anything constructive in that situation, I believe it was to help us to see that, and to help us to grasp the idea that while a group of workers may legitimately break away from a trade union center and set up a new organization because there was good reason to do so, no union should have that type of action as a policy. Paul Robeson was denied an American passport, and he couldn't leave the country. Mine Mill, and I think it's Harvey Murphy mainly, came up with the idea of having a concert at the Peace Arch. The outside civic workers in Vancouver supported that conference, that rally. We popularized it among our members, got people to turn out. In other words, we took a broad public position that we had to have an interest in peace, in how the country is run, how the social welfare system was operating. It was not just enough to get paid 20 cents more for unhooking a sewer connection. We took the position that the leadership took the position that the trade union movement must be one for broad political action, must join with people in the CCF, later the NDP, and even supporters of the old line capitalist party, working people, in fighting to improve our working conditions, our communities, and our lives in general. And some people didn't like that. In the first place, big business didn't want the labor movement to be involved in campaigns against big business. Some of the people in the CCF, which is now the NDP, were socialists in name only. And they didn't want anything to do with the Communist Party because they felt the Communist Party was driving too hard for radical solutions. So you can see that in all this turmoil, and with the world moving towards a confrontation between capitalism and socialism, the labor movement received special attention from a lot of agencies. You can be sure that the attack on our union was duly noted by the roadmen, as we call them, the international representatives of the big international unions. It was duly noted by the security services in Canada. It was effectively noticed and analyzed by the intelligence agencies of the USA. Willy-nilly, I say willy-nilly because I can't think of a better term, a number of little people like myself had to grow up in a hurry. We found ourselves on a big world stage when we weren't really ready for it. We hadn't studied these problems. We haven't gone to any schools. We didn't have much education, but we tried our best. But instinctively, and that's where I feel I have a debt to my former associate Don guys, we recognize one thing, that if we know that our interest lies with the working class, and that the working class, through its labor movement, has to reach out not only on trade union questions, but on broad social questions. Only if we have this attitude can we ever hope that the labor movement will make any decisive changes in the Canadian way of life. We had a worldview, and I have 20, 30, 40 books giving the reports of big international meetings of the World Communist Movement. And up till a few years ago, there was one fundamental platform, shall we say, on which all these analyses rested. That the socialist world, Soviet Union and its allies, the rising colonial movement for liberation, and the working class movement in the Western capitalist countries were the strongest force in the world, and that united they can change the whole world. This is what held us up. This is what inspired us. But now we have a situation in which the Soviet Union is no longer the Soviet Union. The world community of socialist nations does not exist in the sense that it existed before. The former colonial world, like Iraq, Iran, Sudan, you can name many places, Korea, all have their problems. And people like myself have to rethink a lot of the ideas that we accepted and worked by all these years. They were noble principles. Many people made a much bigger contribution than I did, and many of them made a much greater sacrifice. Many of them died for their belief. And yet I do not feel that it was in vain. I feel that we have to go on from here, and we have to assign to the younger generation the analyses that will show the mistakes that were made by the world movement on the left, that will sort out the principles and forms of organization and study that still apply, and will rejuvenate itself, sending new vision, new inspiration to the people of the world. I feel it's on the way. When I read about what's happening in Iraq, for example, and that part of the world, I'm not pessimistic. I see that the inevitable process of the disintegration of imperialism is proceeding, and that nobody has the power to prevent it. As far as our movement on the left is, what I say is, the sooner we learn some of the mistakes and we apply ourselves to doing things a better way, the sooner will imperialism meet insurmountable blocks. And one thing I must add to that, I'm not pessimistic about what is happening in different parts of the world as some of our people are. My feeling is that whether they like it or not, there's no future for Western imperialism. And when I look back at my service in the labor movement, I feel that the greatest contribution that I made is that maybe I convinced a few people to adopt that outlook, and maybe I convinced an even larger group to see that trade unionism can be an honest endeavor to advance the interests of the workers under this system, the capitalist system, and to help them to think beyond the capitalist system. I was on the Central Committee of the Communist Party, the Provincial Committee. I took early retirement in, what was it now? 74. I went to work as the provincial organizer and Labour Secretary of the party. We needed somebody at that time, and I felt young enough to give it a few years, and I stepped in. Looking back, I can say that somebody else, and I can think of a whole number of people, could have done a better job, but I did the best that I could.